Continuing with Harper Lee's American classic, To Kill a Mockingbird, probably the most famous one of the most famous pieces of American literature. We're at chapter 20. Tom Robinson was on the stand in chapter 19, and the prosecuting attorney was just an asshole. Excuse my French. It's not French, but he was a real joke machine. And he was kept on calling Tom Robinson boy, and like the story starts, the pieces start coming together. You realize he's innocent, and the Uwells are just lying, and the daughter, she's just like misconstrued, and the judge, he doesn't like what he's hearing. He doesn't like Atticus proving his case. Atticus is the defense attorney. That's the guy I was named after. My name's not Atticus, it's Gregory. I was named after the actor that played him in the movie. I've been over that. But while we're talking here, if you haven't already, hit the like and subscribe button. And if you're listening, you'll see why you should hit the like and subscribe button. This channel I'm building up. It's going to be a lot better. There's going to be a nice blue screen background. We're going to have a chat going. I'm doing a lot of live streams where I read the book live and answer your questions as the chat is going on. So once again, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, and let's go and get started. Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird, chapter 20. Come on around here, son. I got something that'll settle your stomach. If you remember from the last chapter, young Dill had gotten sick at the sight of the blatant racism. As Mr. Dolphus Raymond was an evil man, I accepted his invitation reluctantly. But I followed Dill. Somehow I didn't think Atticus would like it if we became friendly with Mr. Raymond, and I knew Aunt Alexandra would. Here, he said, offering Dill his paper sack with straws in it, take a good sip. It'll quieten you. Dill sucked on the straws, smiled, and pulled at length. He, said Mr. Raymond, evidently taking delight in corrupting a child. Dill, you watch out now, I warned. Dill released the straws and grinned. Scout, it's nothing but Coca-Cola. Mr. Raymond sat up against the tree trunk. He had been lying on the grass. You little folks won't tell on me now, will you? I'd ruin my reputation if you did. You mean all you drink in that sack's Coca-Cola, just plain Coca-Cola? Yes, ma'am, Mr. Raymond nodded. I like his smell. It was a leather horse's cottonseed. He wore only English riding boots I'd ever seen. That's all I drink most of the time. Then you just pretend you're half... I beg your pardon, sir, I caught myself. I didn't mean to be, Mr. Raymond chuckled. Not at all offended, and I tried to frame a discreet question. Well, why do you do like you do? Well, oh yes, you mean why do I pretend? Well, it's very simple, he said. Some folks don't like the way I live. Now, I could say the hell with them, but I don't care if they don't like it. I do say I don't care if they don't like it right enough, but I don't say the hell with them, see? Dylan and I said, no, sir. I try to give them a reason, you see. It helps folks if they can latch on to a reason. When I come to town, which is seldom, if I weave a little drunk and drink out of the sack, folks can say, oh, Dolphus Ryman's in the clutches of whiskey. That's why he won't change his ways. He can't help himself. That's why he lives the way he does. That ain't honest, Mr. Raymond, making yourself out badder than you already are. It ain't honest, but it's mighty helpful to folks. Secretly, Miss Finch, I'm not much of a drinker, but you see, they could never understand that I live like I do because that's the way I wanted to live. I had a feeling that I shouldn't be here listening to this sinful man who had mixed children and didn't care who knew it. But he was fascinating. I had never encountered a being who deliberately perpetuated fraud against himself. But why had he entrusted us with his deepest secret? I asked him why. So this is the man, Caucasian man that's married to a black woman that has mixed children. And I know the sequel to this book, which comes out like 50 years later, it came out a couple of years ago. It's apparently there's racism that you didn't realize in this book. And I think that kind of comes out with Scout being a little racist as well. You know, like thinking that he's such a bad guy because he has mixed children and everything like that. And everybody thinks he's an alcoholic drinking from this brown paper bag, but really he's just drinking Coca-Cola, and he wants everybody to think he's an alcoholic because then they'd be more accepting with his non-racist ways. I had a feeling that I shouldn't be here listening to this sinful man who had mixed children and didn't care who knew it, but he was fascinating. I had never encountered a being who deliberately perpetuated fraud against himself. But why had he entrusted us with his deepest secret? I asked him why. Because you're children, and you can understand it, he said. And because I heard that one, He jerked his head at Dill. Things haven't caught up with that one instinct yet. Let him get a little older and he won't get sick and cry. Maybe things will strike him as being not quite right, say, but he won't cry, not when he gets a few years on him, after the world had shit on him. I added that part there. That's why children are, like, the best judges of character, or that's why, children see the world differently, because the world has yet to on them. Cry about what, Mr. Raymond? Dill's mildness was beginning to assert himself. Cry about the simple hell people give other people without even thinking. Cry about the hell white people give colored folks without even stopping to think if they're people too. Atticus says cheating a colored man is 10 times worse than cheating a white man, I muttered. Says it's the worst thing you can do. Mr. Raymond said, I don't reckon it's Miss Jean Louise. You don't know your pa's not a run-of-the-mill man. It'll take a few years for that to sink in. You haven't seen enough of the world yet. You haven't even seen this town, but all you got to do is step back inside the courthouse. Which reminded me that we were missing nearly all of Mr. Gilmer's cross-examination. I looked at the sun, and it was dropping fast behind the store tops on the west side of the square. Between two fires, I could not decide which I wanted to jump into, Mr. Raymond or the 5th Judicial Circuit Court. Come on, Dill, I said. You're all right now. Yeah, glad I met you, Mr. Raymond, and thanks for the drink. It was mighty settling. We raced back to the courthouse, up the steps, up 2 flights of stairs, and edged our way to the balcony rail. Reverend Sykes had saved our seats. The courtroom was still, and again I wondered where the babies were. Judge Taylor's cigar was a brown speck in the center of his mouth. Mr. Gilmer was writing on one of the yellow pads on his table, trying to outdo the court reporter, whose hand was jerkingly rapid. Shoot, I muttered, we missed it. Atticus was halfway through his speech to the jury. He had evidently pulled some papers from his briefcase that rested beside his chair. Because they were on his table, Tom Robinson was toying with them. Absence of any corroborative evidence. This man was indicted on a capital charge and is now on trial for life. I punched Jim. How long it's been at? He's just gone over the evidence, Jim whispered, and we're going to win, Scout. I don't see how we can. He's been at it about 5 minutes. He made it plain and easy as well. I'd explain it to you. You could understand it even. Did Mr. Gilmer? Shh, nothing new, just the usual. Hush now. We looked down again. Atticus was speaking easily with the kind of detachment he used when he dictated a letter. He walked slowly up and down in front of the jury, and the jury seemed to be attentive. Their heads were up, and they followed Atticus's route with what seemed to be appreciation. I guess it was because Atticus wasn't a thunderer. Atticus paused, then he did something he didn't ordinarily do. He unhitched his watch and chain and placed them on the table, saying, with the court's permission. Judge Taylor nodded, and then Atticus did something I never saw him do before or since, in public or in private. He unbuttoned his vest, unbuttoned his collar, loosened his tie, and took off his coat. He never loosened a scrap of his clothing until he undressed at bedtime, and to Jim and me, this was the equivalent of him standing before us stark naked. We exchanged horrified glances. Atticus put his hands in his pockets, and as he returned to the jury, I saw his gold collar button and the tips of his pen and pencil winking in the light. Gentlemen, he said. Jim and I again looked at each other. Atticus might have said, Scout. His voice had lost its arity, its detachment, and he was talking to the jury as if they were folks on the post office corner. Gentlemen, he was saying, I shall be brief, but I would like to use my remaining time with you to remind you that this case is not a difficult one. It requires no minute sifting of complicated facts, but it does require you to be sure beyond all reasonable doubt as the guilt of the defendant. To begin with, this case should never have come to trial. This case is as simple as black and white. The state has not produced one iota of medical evidence to the effect of the crime Tom Robinson is charged ever took place. It has relied instead upon the testimony of 2 witnesses whose evidence has not only been called into serious question on cross-examination, but has been flatly contradicted by the defendant. The defendant is not guilty, but somebody in the courtroom is. I have nothing but pity in my heart for the chief witness for the state, but my pity does not extend so far as to her putting a man's life at stake, which she has done in an effort to get rid of her own guilt. I say guilt, gentlemen, because it was guilt that motivated her. She has committed no crime. She has merely broken a rigid and time-honored code of our society, a code so severe that whoever breaks it is pounded from our midst as unfit to live with. She is the victim of cruel poverty and ignorance. But I cannot pity her. She is white. She knew full well the enormity of her offense, but because her desires were stronger than the code she was breaking, she persisted in breaking it. She persisted, and her subsequent reaction is something that all of us have known at one time or another. She did something every child has done. She tried to put the evidence of her offense away from her. But in this case, she was no child hiding from stolen contraband. She struck out at her victim. Of necessity, she must put him away from her. He must be removed from her presence, from this world. She must destroy the evidence of her offense.